This is Christine Madrid French, author of a book about Hitchcock and architecture, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. The modernist architecture we love is exciting, edgy, sometimes inexplicable, often brilliant. Modernism has been around a long time, between 90 and 100 years, depending on which scholar you believe. Yet there's also been a movement beyond traditional modernism, the style of Neutra and Corbusier and Gropius and Breuer and Mies, that's a little wacky, a little genius, and in most cases frequently misunderstood. We're talking about organic architecture, houses that make Neutra look downright classical. Organic architects are a fiercely independent breed, using their intuition like Yoda would use the Force, taking on unusual materials and construction techniques, and sculpting residences that look out of this world. More simply put, organic architecture is to modernism like monks are to priests, and these monks take their craft very seriously. As a client, you tell them what you need, but you are not going to tell them what to design. Frank Lloyd Wright is considered an organic architect, as was John Lautner, both of which we would have loved to have on the show, but they were a little unavailable. Joining us today instead are two prominent living organic architects, Bart Prince and Michael Johnson. Later, we've got jazz with our returning podcast guest, Peter Lamb and the Wolves. And now, here's the monk of martinis, the passionate priest of preservation, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom, for that alliterative introduction. Hi, folks. Over the next few years, you're going to see a lot of articles and videos on, wait for it, postmodernism. Though it popped up as early as the 50s, this reaction to modernism gained power from architects Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi in their 1972 book, Learning from Las Vegas. Hitting its stride in the 1980s through the 1990s, especially with Venturi, Scott Brown, Hugh Newell Jacobson, Philip Johnson, Charles Moore, Michael Graves, and others, postmodernism basically said, screw you to old boxy floor-to-ceiling glass modernism. We're going to do whatever the hell we want, and we don't care if you like it or not, or if it makes any sense to you or not. And build they did. Philip Johnson's famous AT&T building is basically a huge Chippendale top glommed onto an otherwise unremarkable building. Not my cup of tea, but some people love it. It's getting overhauled by the Norwegian architects Snohetta. I think they're keeping that Chippendale top. That's the thing about architecture. Features that people can't stand at construction sometimes become beloved 30 years later. If there were right-wing conservative Republican modernists, a category I'm not sure exists in the wild, they would try to ban postmodernism, much like President Trump and the National Civic Arts Society have been trying to do for years with regular old modernism. Fortunately, postmodernism pretty much petered out, but some of those buildings are going to be 40 to 50 years old soon, and the debates on their preservation and destruction are heading right towards us. Classical buildings, modernist buildings, postmodern buildings, and organic buildings, they are all good, and a diversity of styles has worked for decades and continues to. When I'm asked about how I feel about postmodernism, my answer is, I would like to love it more. But I'm just not that into it. We are just going to be friends. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architect Michael Johnson taught for 28 years at the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in Arizona and has been a professor at universities in Greece and Bulgaria. Originally from Wisconsin, he first fell for the organic architecture of Bruce Goff, and they were friends. Since then, he shifted to the more traditional modernism of Mies van der Rohe and Corbusier. Michael has worked in Cave Creek, Arizona since 1976, known for his love of clean lines and steel and glass, his attention to interiors, and for his deep knowledge and pronounced opinions about the profession. Welcome to U.S. Modernist, Michael.
Well, good to be with you.
Michael, I'm so glad to talk with you. I want to find out about how this architecture bug hit you. I know that you built a house with your dad and brother when you were 10. Is that right?
Wow.
That's correct.
What do you remember about that?
Well, one of the great stories of that is that my father had just gotten out of the service, and like a lot of the GIs, they built a house for themselves. And he chose to do that. So he had a hole dug and put a basement in. And then I arrived on Saturday morning, and he gave me a shovel and asked me to backfill the block wall. Okay. So I struggled with this for about 3 weeks and got one side of the building backfilled, and he brought in a machine. And that machine did it in about 20 minutes, finished it up. And I said, Dad, what was that all about? And he said, I wanted to teach you the potential of a shovel, and I wanted to teach you the potential of a machine. Okay, so that was the kind of father I had. He was military, he was professional military, and it was a lesson well learned.
And he was an educator, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was disably discharged because of a rheumatic heart condition, and he was a colonel in the military, and he was set to go to Washington, D.C. with a star. It was the biggest disappointment in his life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but he was a great guy. So I fortunately started to learn about building through my father, because every summer we built a house for friends and relatives. So by the time I was 18, I pretty well knew how to put a building together, which 98% of the architects don't know. They're built out by engineers. So anyways, I worked for this really good architect who was both an engineer and an architect. And, that's where I really got solidity of my work comes through knowing structure and being able to structurally design a building.
When you were in Milwaukee, did you make the pilgrimage over to Spring Green, Wisconsin to visit Frank Lloyd Wright?
Oh, yes, I did. And in fact, I'm going to be there for my birthday, my 85th birthday in Spring Green in July. The first time I went to Spring Green was 1956.
So 3 years before he died, you got to meet him, I suppose.
Yes. Well, I didn't meet him there. Where I met him was in Milwaukee. Augie Pabst was a race car driver and the son of beer people. And he and an eventual client of mine built Elkhart Lake. And Augie Pabst imported used vehicles from Europe. And my buddy and I would go every month. It was a small shop. Maybe you had 7 cars in the showroom.
Were these are passenger cars, race cars?
These are Jags and Porsches and Rolls Royces and the like.
Oh.
But anyway, my buddy and I would go down there every month to see the new cars that came in. And as I got out of my car, I see this Rolls Royce painted in what Wright referred to as Taliesin red, but I call it boxcar red. At any rate, the car had been painted this awful red. And I was standing there with my buddy, and I said, God, what damn fool ruined this good car, painting it this color? And all of a sudden, there's a tap on my shoulder with a cane and a pork pie hat, and Frank Lloyd Wright said to me, well, the greatest architect in the world painted this color. And I say, you might be the greatest architect in the world, but you're a lousy car painter. And he chuckled and spun around with his cape flowing and went back into the store.
Oh, that's hilarious.
But that's the only encounter I ever had with him.
Michael, almost 10 years ago now, the architect Frank Gehry came out with a statement that 95% of buildings are just shit. But you've come out with a statement that 99% of the buildings are just shit. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I said it a lot sooner than Gary. I said that back when I was a 30-year-old kid in the business. So, yes, I believe that only 1% of the buildings are really architecture. And subsequently, who's building them but AIA members? And the reality of that is that because you belong to an organization doesn't not mean you are an architect, nor if you license yourself are you an architect. Your work tells us what is architecture, and what is the alternative to that is just merely buildings. And somehow the AIA and the whole organization, they've kind of absconded the word architect, okay? Because I think of them as building technicians, not architects.
I believe you once said if visual pollution was criminal, 95% architects would be in jail.
I certainly said that. I got a new one for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
AIA, assholes in action.
Wow.
Oh, man.
Well, I'm not on the radio now, and he's going to add it. And I think that it makes sense. Right.
If architects are not doing the right thing, in your opinion, what should they be doing? What should that 95% be doing differently than they are now, Michael?
Well, that is a really good question. And the reason that it's a good question is that schlock architects can do good architecture. And I always say the best architecture done by licensed architects in their profession was done when they were in college. You know why? Very simply, I was their teacher. I was their client. And of course, they were given the skills and the theory of architecture to know architecture from just building. So they do the best work when they're in college, and then they get out. And they capitulate to society. What I felt for years, they're selling their souls, okay, for money. But the irony is that we live in a cultureless society, and the client is the driving force of the design, not the architect. He's just taking the money and doing what the client wants. And that's why we have all this junk around that we're looking at.
Well, how do you do architecture without those pesky clients?
I made a commitment when I was 19 years old and I started in architecture. I was never going to sell my soul. And I built a house for myself. It was published in the Milwaukee Journal. I got a client off of it. I was still, when I was working in an office, I was a chief draftsman at Windsor's office. And then one led to the next. And there's a little story about Cave Creek. There's an architect here. I won't mention his name. He's a very pedestrian architect, does what the client wants. And I bumped into him in a bar in Cave Creek one day, and he kind of points his finger at my chest and said, I can do what you do. And I can do what Al Beadle does, and I can do what Will Bruder does, just like you guys. And I said, no, you can't. You know why? The kind of people that are sophisticated and cultured already know us. They don't know about what you can do or not do. So you're not on the radar to get a good client. One of the great Italian architects said, if you do good work comes to you. If you do bad work comes to you. Simple. Okay.
Kind of the law of attraction, right?
Yeah. And it's an interesting quote from Glenn Murcott's father, where he said, start your career like you want to end it.
Huh.
Yeah. So now the visual pollution comment that I made,
Yes.
that was actually a derivative of Al Beadle. He said if visual pollution were toxic, we'd all be dead by now.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah.
Same idea.
And then I thought, no, all the architects should be in jail. Right. So
Has it gotten worse?
I think so. Again, my solution to it would be this. As a former educator and looking at my children and my grandchildren that have gone through school and education, I think that what's really lacking education is that starting in kindergarten, children should begin to be introduced to the top of the top, whether it's music or whether it's painting or architecture or dance, theater. And that should continue all the way through the college level, where we develop a sophisticated clientele for the architect, and then they will demand the architect to perform, as I demanded it when they were students.
When we talked with Bart Prince, he talked about his process for working with a client.
Yeah.
And basically getting very personal with the client, understanding who they are as people, and helping solve their issues within a house, such that the house really evolves from the inside of the house to the outside. And you seem to have a similar philosophy. You have much more of a focus on design that privileges the interiors.
Well, yeah, there's no question about that, because you drive up to your house after going to work all day, and you have a glimpse of your house as you get home, and then you go inside the home. That's where all the money should be spent instead of superfluous facing materials. And that's how I finally got down to doing more precise European modernism direction than the organic direction, because I was sick and tired of leaky roofs. I was sick and tired of spending all my money on geometry instead of building performance, meeting the needs of families that live in it, circulation and order of structure. That the Germans and the French, Czechs, if you think about Corbusier and you think about Corbusier's machine for living,
yes,
that certainly resonated with me as I matured in architecture. And I know that a lot of my old colleagues, Herb Green is one of my closest friends. He's still alive,
Oh, yeah.
And Leela, his niece, is doing a film on him.
We've had her on as a guest, yes.
You have? Okay.
Yes.
Isn't she delightful?
She's wonderful.
Yeah. But Herb knew my early work, and then Leela was working in Phoenix, and there was a magazine with one of my buildings on the cover, and Herb said, well, that's an old friend of mine, Leela. But at any rate, I kind of teased Herb. He doesn't like white buildings.
Right.
Yeah, and I said, Herb, I want to tell you something. You wrote a book, Mind and Image, about 50 years ago, where you thought that Corbusier Rochamp was one of the greatest buildings ever built, and it's white. And your favorite philosopher is James Whitehead.
Well,
so get over your aversion to white.
On a practical basis, Michael, the organic architect's designs are really beautiful, but they're sometimes so unusual, it's hard for the clients to get financing. Bart was telling us about, one of those occasions, and it happens just on Miesian houses, but even more so with these organic houses.
Yeah, certainly it costs more money to build organic architecture. And you're always what I call defensive detailing.
What is that?
In other words, you dream something up, and then you got to figure out how to goddamn build it. And with modernism, there's just some dead fast rules of simplicity.
Tell us about your friendship with Bruce Goff. How did you meet?
Well, I was working in a really bad office, an old Polish architect, nice guy, but lousy architect. It was the second job I had in architecture. And he had all the magazines for years and years and years. So I ran across a 1948 article in Architectural Forum on Goff's work, and it really intrigued me. And I called him up. At that time, he was in the Price Tower in Bartlesville. And he said, well, just come stop by. So I had a wife and 2 kids at the time, and I just jumped in my car and drove to Bartlesville. And that's where I met him. And that was back in the 50s, late 50s. We were friends until he passed on. I would visit him at least twice a year. And he came to visit me in Wisconsin a couple of times. He was like a surrogate father to me. He was a gentle soul, absolute gentle soul. He introduced me to so many things through conversation. I didn't know anything about Gustav Klimt. I didn't know anything about, I knew a lot about classical music because of my mother, but I never connected architecture and music until I talked to Bruce. Everybody called him BG.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was known as BG to all of his students and friends, but I always called him Bruce.
I've been able to find the issue of Architecture Forum. It looks like, at least in July of 1950.
Well, it's 48.
48.
1948.
Do you remember the month of that?
I still have a copy somewhere around here.
Okay.
I stole it from that office.
Oh.
I figured he'll never look at it.
He'll never
again.
miss it.
And he never learned anything. I was really fortunate as a young man. I was very self-confident, and that's how I met Goff. That's how I met Paulo. Just called him up. Victor Lundy, Ulrich Franzan, they were all acquaintances of mine, if not friends. And that was something that was very enriching for me and challenging for me because I wanted to be as talented and as skilled as they were.
Isn't that good, though, that you just took the initiative to reach out to these people? Because so many people are unwilling to do that in their careers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I had no fear in a way,
That's exactly what it is. It's fear is what holds people back from doing that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did it ever backfire on you?
No. I met Paul Rudolph that way. I just called him up, and he said, just stop by the office. And he spent a lot of time with me. That's the way I developed a relationship with Bruno Zevi, the critic from Italy. I was either naive, stupid, or brave. That's how that happened.
And when people hire you, one of the things that you've been quoted on many times is you just want them to leave you alone, to let you work.
Yes.
How does that work for the client?
Well, generally when the client comes to me, they know what I do. And the methods I do are driven by site, budget, a structural system that marries the site and the budget to an efficient machine. So they generally leave me alone. I do have kind of a funny story, as I have, believe it or not, 4 different clients, and they're all Frenchmen. And the only thing that I have to do is do a little bit of extra work on the toilet rooms, because I don't know, the French seem to be obsessed with toilet rooms.
Okay.
Okay.
These are
or bathrooms.
Bathrooms, okay.
They're very fussy about them. And certainly I listen to them and I try to accommodate their fussiness. But generally speaking, you know what I do, you hire me to do it, and I have this statement that everybody should be aware of. If you have a hole in your shoe, don't go to a dentist. If you got a hole in your tooth, don't go to a cobbler, okay?
Yep.
So that kind of sums it up. You're coming to me because I know what the hell I'm doing.
So really there's a high degree of trust that the clients have to have in you.
In the client, yeah.
And that you are a known quantity, and they should know what they're getting.
Yes, exactly. I mean, when somebody went to Frank Lloyd Wright, they knew what they were getting. And they also knew that he didn't care about budgets. And that's one of my frustrations with a lot of my colleagues. A real good friend of mine is Eddie Jones. He won't take a client with a budget. It has to be open-ended. Will Bruder, who apprenticed with me as a youngster, he's the same way. He can't meet a budget. And to me, that's one of my obsessions, is to deliver it within a reasonable budget. When Dwell came out?
Sure.
The magazine?
Yeah, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I began to call it the Dwell disease, because I show all these projects that the costs of them are outrageous, and they never published the cost. So you had all these young folks come to you, and they have wide eye and bushy tail, and then I analyze their budget, I analyze their need, and I say, you got to come up with more money, or you got to reduce the scope of the work.
Well, that wasn't just Dwell. That was, many magazines put out these houses that are, really blinged out, and you can't possibly afford them.
No. There was one project here, and I can only talk about this because Eddie and Will are good friends of mine, okay? But Will was hired for a project, and he had a budget of I think it was $4 million. And what he designed, the bids came in at $18 million.
Wow.
Oh.
So then they switched to Eddie, and they raised the budget from $4 million to $6 million. Okay. And by the time Eddie got done with them, it was $13 million. So, now, that also happened with Scofidio and Diller.
Yeah.
Liz and Rick hired me as a representative on 2 projects here in Arizona. One of them was a house for a former client of mine. And he started out hiring Calatrava.
Wow, that's going big.
Yeah, and of course I knew Calatrava well, and he was a friend of mine due to my connection with Taliesin. And at any rate, Calatrava designed one, and the contractor that was going to build it, I had worked with on the restaurant for the same client. And I said, "What's the budget?" And he said $3 million, and it was only a small 1,600, 1,800 square foot house. Well, the contractor asked me to look at it, and he said, "What do you think it's going to bid out at?" And I said, "Well, it's going to bid out at about $8 million and end up 10." So Calatrava took another whack at it, and same size house, and the damn thing comes in at $14 million, even though the client increased the budget.
Well, why do these budgets get so crazily out of control? Is it that changes come down the line, or simply they have no clue what the materials are going to be?
They don't really understand the building side of it, I think is his major point.
Yeah, they're naive. Okay. Because, in college you're designing fantasy drawings, and they'll never be built or never be proven.
And nobody has to pay for them.
So your imagination go crazy.
Yeah.
Whereas, also the discipline. And the fortunate thing is that because of my experience with my father, when I got into my own practice of architecture, I was the contractor. I framed the houses. I laid the block. In other words, if you look at any photograph of the house that I live in and my studio, those things I built with a friend of mine and 2 Mexican kids. We did everything. We did electrical, plumbing. I can build a house from the ground up. Not anymore because I'm 85 years old.
Yeah. Well, but you can rent the backhoe.
Yeah. Well, we even did excavation. We would rent a backhoe, and we did all the excavation and everything.
Uh-huh.
So I also believe that the architectural education in the United States is pathetic. I know in Greece and Italy and Germany, if you look at the curriculum that they study versus the curriculum here, they come out, they're architects, period. The architects that graduate, I don't give a shit if they come from Harvard, ASU, or Timbuktu. The architect has to teach them when they get out because they don't have the tools.
What should the AIA and architecture be doing now to try to turn some of this around, in your opinion, Michael?
Well, the AIA is a difficult situation in my mind because it's a fraternal organization where if you pay them $900, you can put that after your name. There's no qualifications for joining. Anybody can join if they pay the money.
No, wait a second. I don't think that's true.
No?
You cannot just join the AIA, pay the $900, and put AIA behind your name.
You have to be an architect.
Yeah, you do have to have that.
Yeah. But nonetheless, every architect, no matter how lame he is or how great he is, pays the same $900. The only organization I belong to is the International Academy of Architecture, and that way you can only be there if you're nominated.
Yeah.
And do you know anything about the International Academy?
I'm looking them up right now.
Yeah. And you'll see the litany of architects that are there and involved.
I can see Daniel Libeskind is involved in that.
How big is it?
We only have about 250 members. Bruno Zevi was the one that started it years ago.
Let's see here. Frank Gehry, Bart Prince, Kenneth Frampton, Wallace Cunningham, Stephen Hall, Moshe Safdie. There's Michael Johnson, Calatrava, Arthur Dyson, Tom Main, Kendrick Kellogg, Peter Eisenman, Will Bruder, Antoine Predock. All these are people kind of in that organic movement at some point or another in their careers.
Mm-hmm. Again, you can see the litany of architects. These are all really good architects, whereas the AIA is filled with just people paying $900 and they're licensed architects.
Doesn't some organization, Michael, have to represent all architects, irregardless of talent?
Well, it's sort of like the Boy Scouts, right? They have to take all covers.
Do you have to get merit badges?
I mean, what else would the AIA do? I mean, if it's supposed to represent all of architecture, it has to accept everybody that is certified, where an organization like yours is serving the purpose of a more specialized group.
Well, it's demanding a certain level of competence to be a member.
Yeah.
And your work has to be competent, and it has to be architecture. With the AIA, it's just a fraternal organization. And, it also misrepresents to the public, because most people in the public think if you're not a member of the AIA, you're not an architect, even though you're a licensed architect. So I could not solve the puzzle of the AIA, but I can tell you one thing. Pull up the curriculum in the European countries and see the rigidity of the education. The student work that I see there unilaterally is far greater than anything that comes out of the United States.
And you've taught both in Greece and Bulgaria.
Yeah, and I've lectured in Germany. I've done seminars and workshops. Even Mexico. Mexico has a much better educational system for architects.
And you've done bathrooms in France.
Yeah. At any rate, I would say if our educational system here would model what they're doing in Europe. And the nice thing about that is that you can go to Germany or Greece, specifically Germany. You can get a free education there if you commit to working there for 5 years after you graduate, which is great because, I had students breaking down in tears because they're $100,000, $125,000 in debt.
Yeah, right.
And that's in all professions. We don't have a corner on the market.
Eris Georges, who is a colleague of Michael's, wrote this about him. Michael remains one of the endangered species in the field. He is one of the last representatives of artists who have never drawn a line between their life and work, who practice architecture on strong ethical codes and personal convictions. His buildings are highly interactive, as all conventional boundaries of space are reinterpreted in light of innovation, comfort, and awareness. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Yes, it was kind of fun. I hope it makes sense.
George and I were talking with architect Michael Johnson. New Mexico native Bart Prince discovered the work of Frank Lloyd Wright in middle school. And by the time he went to Highland High School in Albuquerque,
Go Hornets!
He was already designing for a local builder. A graduate in architecture from Arizona State University, he then spent several decades working for the legendary Bruce Goff. He finished up the Pavilion for Japanese Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art after Goff's death. He founded his own practice in 1973 in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and since then he's designed inspired buildings throughout the Southwest. You can see his houses at usmodernist.org/prints. Welcome, Bart.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Bart, you could be like one of these Yellowstone series on TV. I mean, your family goes back, a couple hundred years?
Oh.
In New Mexico.
But do you look like Kevin Costner?
He does a little bit.
I think so.
Oh, okay. I hope your family is a little more functional than them, but
yeah.
We digress.
Probably not.
If I recall my high school history, this was not long after the U.S. seized New Mexico in the Mexican-American War. So
that's right.
Yeah, so your great-grandfather was a governor around 1880?
1889, I think, to 93, around in there.
Okay.
Governor
Wow.
of New Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, so you really are like part of a
The dynasty.
Yeah.
Now, at 17, Bart, what were you designing for that local builder?
He owned a number of lots in the development. I think it was an area that he had developed. and was building spec houses. I had actually built the house that my parents eventually bought and we moved into. I was very interested in construction and watching the construction, so I was there all the time. I'd get out of school, and that's where I would go until they stopped, and they tried to get me to not bother them, but after a while they figured I may as well try and help around there, clean up and that sort of thing. So he had noticed me building models of buildings that I had designed in the garage. And of course, they were all kind of strange looking things, at least from his standpoint. But he asked me one day if I could take a lot that he had and make a design. And that's how it started. I mean, when I showed him what I wanted to do, he said, "Oh, well, we can't build that, but we can do something, kind of clean it up a little bit."
They were a little right influenced, perhaps?
I don't know that they were right influenced necessarily, but they were quite different from the sort of builders' houses he was building. That clean and simple, not with all the stuff that builders like to stick on the houses. And anyway, I think I did eventually 2 or 3 of those that he built. So it was a good experience for me because I was doing the drawings and seeing them built. I also saw what it was like working with the contractor and having him make unnecessary changes, because it was his house. So it was a good experience.
Now, how did you come to meet Bruce Goff? Was that at the University of Oklahoma?
No, I was going to Arizona State University in Tempe, and he came to the school to give a talk. And in the days before he was to get there was talk around the school, but a lot of it was kind of negative from the faculty. And I remember one faculty member saying, "Well, this is not somebody you want to see the work he's doing and all that." And of course, that was the wrong thing to tell me because I thought, I want to see why that's the case. And then when it came time for Goff to actually arrive at the school, several of the faculty made a point of walking out.
Wow.
I remember one of them saying, "Well, I'm not going to be in the same building as Bruce Goff." And of course, then I really got intrigued because I didn't know too much about him. I had heard a little bit about him and seen a couple of things. But so I went to the talk, and then afterwards, we all got together to sit and talk with him. And then the next day, I went out to Solari's with him because I had been going out to Solari since I started going to ASU. And
Paolo Solari's Arcosante?
No, Cosante.
Cosante in town.
Built.
Yeah.
Yeah. Arcosante hadn't even been started yet.
Okay.
But I knew Paolo and Collie, his wife. And so we went out there. And then after a while, Goff came to the school to take a tour of the school. And another student was walking him through the school. And every time he came to a project that interested him, he'd stop and say, "Well, who did that?" And it turned out that it was one of mine, and then another one of mine. And then finally, later in the afternoon, I was back at living in one of these houses like students do. A whole group of students live in the same place, and there was a knock at the door, and one of the other students answered the door, and they called for me, and it was Bruce Goff. And behind the student and behind me when I came to the door was a big model of mine that was leaning up against the wall. And Goff just looked past me and he says, "I want to meet the person that designed that," and pointed to it. And I was standing right there, and I said, "Well," of course, we had met by then. And so that's kind of how it started. And then he asked me if I wanted to come the next summer to, he was in Kansas City at the time, to work for the summer. So, and I still had another year of school to finish after that. So I went to Kansas City for that summer and then came back and finished my degree in architecture. And then I went back to work for him in Kansas City the next summer, and I moved him down to Tyler, Texas. That was 1970. So that's how I first got to know him and started working with him.
And we've also talked with some of the family of Herb Green,
Yes.
who were working on a documentary about his life. How did you meet Herb along the way here?
Well, let's see. It was sometime after meeting Goff. In fact, I think it was that summer of 1969. Goff didn't drive, but he liked to go places in the car, and so he always needed somebody to drive him. And we went to Kentucky, and I met Herb. That's where Herb was teaching at the time. And then we drove all the way across the country to visit Lloyd Wright and Eric Wright. And that summer was a good part of that summer of 1969 was spent going kind of all over the place, looking at Goff's work, looking at Wright's work. And so, yeah, that's when I met Herb, and he's been a good friend since then.
The first house I can find for you, Bart, is one that you designed for Pat and Joni Grant in White Rock. Was that your first completed commission?
No, it was a house next to it.
Okay.
It was known as the O'Brien House, Hal O'Brien. And both Hal and Pat were at Los Alamos, which was up the hill from White Rock. And they were both scientists up there. And a lot of the people working there would build in this adjacent community known as White Rock, which wasn't very far away, just down the hill. And so I designed a house for the O'Briens. I think that was about 1974. And Pat and his wife saw what I was doing, and they had the lot right next door to the O'Briens. And so then I started working on a design for them. So the O'Briens started first, and the Grant House construction started toward the end of the work on the O'Brien House. But those were the first two. I had done an addition to a building in Albuquerque before that. And then I had done a couple of buildings here while working for an architect. The state of New Mexico required, like most states, a certain amount of apprenticeship time before you can get your license. And they required a certain amount of time working in the state. And so I was working for an architect here and designed a couple of buildings that were completely my designs, an apartment building and also an office building. So those were built before the Grant House and the O'Brien House.
When I look at these two houses as well as your other houses, they very much look hopeful and inspiring and optimistic like the future. Is that one common denominator about your work, is that it's kind of future-oriented?
Well, I think so. I mean, we're always in the kind of the continuous present, and you can never really go into the future. But I think my thinking was that we ought to be building for our own time. Around here, all over New Mexico, there's a big influence of the Native American buildings, which I love, except the imitations of them are horrible. Yeah. So you have all these Roadrunner cartoon-looking houses going up that are brown houses that all look the same. And I always felt like if the Native people were building using the same creative process that they used when they were originally building, they would be building something that's much different than the things that they had originally done. And they loved color and they loved design and all the things that were being ignored for the most part in architecture.
Is that part of what organic architecture is about?
Yeah, it's about relation to nature and relating to the land. Building has to result from growth, essentially. People kind of get confused when they think of organic because they begin to think of things that, look like a seashell or a tree or something natural like that. But it's not what it looks like. It's sort of the process, the growth process. And it begins not with a preconception. It doesn't start from the outside in. It doesn't start with a preconceived form. A lot of buildings we see now do, where the architect has an idea of what he wants to look like, then he works backwards.
Right.
And stuffs everything into that form. And the idea of a more organic approach is that it grows from within based on the requirements and the client's needs and the site and the climate and all these kinds of things factor into it. And you don't know what it's going to become. I mean, even though you're creating it, it doesn't create itself, and the clients aren't creating it, but you're constantly responding to all these things. You're responding to the various building codes, height limits, zoning codes, the climate, the terrain. And instead of going in on a hill and just suddenly, immediately grading out a level pad, because you're going to drop another builder's burger out of the airplane.
Right.
You start with a site and then begin working with the views and the various, the direction of the wind and, if there are earthquake problems or drainage problems. And
this seems like it would be a difficult sell for some clients, though, who want to know what their house is going to look like.
Well,
but they must trust you.
They have to, because I know I had a woman call me one time and she said, I want you to design my house. And I said, oh, well, what brings you to me? Well, you designed the so-and-so people's house. And they're great friends of mine, and I trust them. And I said, well, have you ever seen their house? No, I haven't seen it, but I know if they had you design it. I said, well, I think you better go.
You better go take a look at it.
Look at their house. And I never heard from her again, because you got to have somebody that's come to you. You can't go to them. They've got to come to you, and they've got to come to you because
probably a blessing.
They see something
that she didn't call you back.
Oh, of course. I mean, had she, I would have ended up not doing anything anyway. But people who they see something in the work, people can be very literal. You can't blame them. They see something and they might say, well, I want one of those. And I'll say, well, I designed that for somebody else and for another situation. And they can't imagine that you could give them something as good as what they saw, because they're thinking, well, that's what I like now. But if they trust you, they'll wait and see, and they should be surprised. I mean, if they're not surprised when you show it to them, I don't think you've done a very good job. You're kind of leading them along, but they're never part of the process in the early stages in terms of me showing them anything. They're part of the process in that we're in touch. We're talking about it. I'm asking them questions. What do they like? What do they don't like? Materials they like, materials they don't like, things like that, how they live. We don't talk about shapes.
Now, you've been in your house, Bart, for almost 40 years.
Yeah.
AKA the bug house, AKA the hovercraft house, AKA the spaceship UFO house. I mean, your houses are wildly creative. They don't look like the house down the street. So they really have to trust you if they're engaging you.
Yeah, they do. They do. I mean, it's amazing that they do. But there are a few people that do. I mean, they get interested in something. I did have a client a number of years ago who had seen several of my buildings in photographs and in magazines and things. And they called me about designing a house for them in Northern California. And we talked on the phone quite a bit about it. And they seemed enthusiastic. And we set a date for them to come see me. And they flew out here and they rented a car and we had a meeting set at a certain time. What I didn't know then was when they got here, he later told me this, they sat out in the driveway for almost 30 minutes saying, "Are we ready for this?" He said, and they didn't tell me. They came in, we had our meeting, and they were, they seemed very positive. And it wasn't until later he said, well, let's see what he does. But they were concerned. And then when I showed them, probably a month and a half, whatever time later, I actually took the drawings and a small model out to California, where they were living in Pasadena at the time. And even then they were amazed, they were excited, but they were still a little worried, but they decided to keep moving ahead. So it's a step at a time. And you do have to gain their trust, let them know that you're trying to do something for them. Essentially, you're creating a portrait of the client. I mean, what I did for them, I would have never done for anybody else because it wouldn't have occurred to me. And it doesn't have anything to do with specific. They're not suggesting ideas. That's not how I work.
But it's still a reflection of them in a way.
Yeah, it's a reflection of them and
of the location.
Things that I see in them and, in the location and all the aspects of the building that all tie together. As I said, it's a continuous. You're responding to all these things. You're responding to things they tell you. You're responding to what you see on the site. People started calling my house the spaceship house or all these other things. And I got a piece of mail actually the other day from American Express and just said spaceship house, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Really?
And I got the letter. And
wow.
The house I'm talking about that I did for these people that later told me they were trying to decide, are we ready for this? And we got their house under construction after a good deal of, this was in California, so there's a lot of hurdles building there and restrictions and things like that. But as the house was going up, the names come to it. I mean, I don't name them. I know Wright liked to a lot of times give names to his houses. I've not done that, but they started calling it the whale house, I guess, because of what people saw. And Architectural Digest did an article on it, and they referred to it as an A-frame on acid.
It's sort of like a Rorschach blot.
Yeah, it is. Because people are used to if they look at, a building with a pitched roof and a couple of windows and a door at the bottom, the first thing that comes to mind is house. But when they look at some of the things that I've done, they don't. That's the last thing that comes to mind. And people come here every day. I mean, the buses,
really,
tour buses stop every day, and I can hear them talking over the loudspeaker outside my studio.
Oh yeah. This is an exceptional house he lives in.
No telling what they're saying. But I used to have a couple of dachshunds, and they would hear them play a tape of an interview with me, and the dogs would start barking.
Oh, my God.
They thought I was
funny.
outside. People are interested. I mean, they're curious. They're not all curious enough to want to do something themselves, but they should be. I mean, there ought to be as many different kinds of houses as there are different kinds of people.
Bart, one of your clients who came to you, I'm sure was very comfortable with what you were going to do because he was the nephew of Alden Dow, the great Michigan modernist architect, and you designed a home for Henry Whiting in Idaho.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, Henry called one day and said he was coming through Albuquerque. Of course, I hadn't met him, didn't know him. This is before cell phones or any kind of communication like that. And he showed up in a Volkswagen bus with a dog. And I didn't know anything about him. I didn't know any of the background, but he came in and I showed him some of the work. He didn't say too much about what he was thinking of doing. His wife wasn't with him. She was flying separately, I think. I think she eventually actually came here and they drove on, but it started with that. So he had seen some things that I'd done, other things, and started to tell me about possible sites in Idaho. And he was looking at more than one possible site at that time, and eventually settled on one. And again, starting with the program, his program was he wanted to build a house for he and his wife, but he also wanted me to treat the program almost as though it was a spec house. So it had to be something that could work for other people too, because he said that his plan was to build it, live in it for a while, and sell it and maybe do something else.
And I think he's still there, right?
Well, he bought Teeter's Knoll, which was the only Frank Lloyd Wright house in Idaho, in Bliss, Idaho. It was kind of run down. And somewhere during this process, he bought that. I think it was a little bit later, because then he began spending a lot of time restoring that little artist studio known as Teeter's Knoll. But we built the house here, in Idaho, the one that he had met with me here to discuss.
Where was it in Idaho?
It was
Haley, Idaho.
Yeah, it was Haley, but we always referred to it as, there's a series of little towns around there. But yeah, Haley was officially the closest Greenhorn Ranch or something like that. And there weren't many buildings at all in there at the time.
So a little background on Henry Whiting. He was the great nephew of Alden Dow, and he did buy in about 1982 the Teeters Knoll Frank Lloyd Wright House in Bliss, Idaho.
In Bliss, right.
That's right.
Yeah.
He started a massive restoration, including fixing the roof, replacing windows, restoring siding, enlarging the kitchen, and he wrote several books about it and took photographs. In the early 1990s, bathroom required restoration after a fire. Unable to sell it to anybody, he rented it to a sculptor, Lynn Fawcett, who 2 years later became his wife.
Right.
Oh. They met when he was hired by her parents to design a koi pond for a different Frank Lloyd Wright house, the 1961 Fawcett House. So it's kind of all intertwined together, this modernism.
That's right. Yeah. And then he and Lynn lived in the Teeter house until she died. And yeah, she used that as a home and studio. And Henry's still there, and he's still working on it, constantly adding to it, not structurally adding to it, but finishing touches and things like that. So he's done a complete restoration.
Bart, I wanted to ask you, what would you like the general public to know more about organic architecture so that they understand it better?
Well, I hardly use that term because it's so tied in and associated with Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, it actually almost became, in many people's mind, the name of the style. And of course, Wright doesn't have a style, but I mean, that's how people often think of it. But as I said, my idea of what organic means has to do with the process and the approach. And I think what's important for people to know is that, it's something that is very straightforward, that it's not like an intellectual approach to architecture and a lot of the sort of outside-in approaches, which is based on, how something looks, and then you turn it into what you want by stuffing things inside. It's something that grows from the requirements, so that people should know that you're not trying to foist something onto them. You're not trying to make them build something that has nothing to do with them. You're actually working the other way. You're trying to solve their problems, and you're very approachable. I mean, Bruce Goff, for example, was very easygoing, very approachable, easy to talk to, and I think the same is the case with Herb Green and with me as well. You work with the clients. I know many architects that think of the client as their enemy, or think of the contractor as their enemy. I think you've got to go the other way, because you're all working together toward the same end.
But it's a very personal process, evidently. I mean, if you are really trying to solve issues for the individuals inside the house, and the exterior of the house is just the end result of that process, that really is opposite from the way most houses are done.
Exactly opposite. It is. And of course, you start at the beginning with the idea that this approach is going to be that you're really working more as an artist, in the sense that you're creating something that you don't know what it's going to be until you get there, but it's going to be different than, typical buildings, because the whole approach is different. You're not trying to be different just to be different. Wright was not trying to be different. His buildings were considered quite unusual and different to people seeing them because they looked so unusual at the time, but that wasn't his goal. He was really working with the idea of space and materials and the land, and it became what it became. But I don't want to make it sound like it happens by itself, because it's still something that's completely under the architect's control. And when I show a client a design, like I said, I know architects will show them 2 or 3 because they don't want to lose the job. So they're afraid of what they're doing. And, what if they don't like this? So they'll have 2 or 3 things ready. I think that's a terrible way to go. You've got to show them what you really feel they ought to do and lead them through it when you show them I never have a client come in and if I've got a model, for example, I've seen architects that will have a whole presentation up on the wall and models sitting in the middle of the room. And they walk in and they don't know where to look. With me, they come in and sit down at an empty table. The drawings are upside down on the table. And I show them one thing at a time and I lead them through it just as it was designed. And I keep referencing things we discussed. Here's the cat door, things that were very important to them.
Right.
This relationship works just as you said you wanted. I don't ever label those drawings because I don't want them to get ahead of me as I'm trying to explain it. And then you lead them through it one thing at a time, and eventually I might show them a section through it. And then elevations are really useless in architecture because they're difficult for people to read. Although people think in terms of just a head-on shot of a house, and of course it just looks like a house to them. But my buildings, when you just look straight at it from any point of view, it's a continuous thing that's always in motion, never stands still to have its picture taken. If you move a little bit this way or that way, it's something else. And then I might bring the model out if I've got a model. And so then they're looking at it. It's an unusual thing. It's a surprise, but they know because they've been led through it. They realize, oh, here's where you showed us this and here's where you showed us that. So they feel like they're a part of the whole thing. But I don't ever show them any of this during the process.
So it's like on TV, like with the big reveal at the end of a show where they come in and they just see it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they've been a part of it the whole time in terms of discussions and, asking them things. They don't really know where it's heading. But I remember a client I always go out to the site with them before starting anything. It's important to see the site with the client to find out, this is ahead of time, find out why they bought the property and what they like and what they don't like. And I remember during the design process, I called the client and I said, well, if you were in the house that you want on this site, if you were in the master bedroom on that site, and forgetting structure and form and all that, where would you want to be? Would you want to be on the north side of the site, on the ground? Would you want to be in the middle of the site, 10 feet up? Or, in other words, just imagine yourself, given what you know about the site, and they respond pretty well to that. Well, I'd like to be well above the ground. I would like to be looking out toward the certain direction. The wind comes from this other direction, and there's the ocean. So they're thinking, and it's abstract, but they're thinking about real things.
And they're giving you useful answers.
Yeah, they're giving me answers. They're not telling me how to hold it up. They're not telling me what the form is.
Right.
But
they're also not going, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I remember one client, I said in the early process, I said, well, how many bedrooms do you need and different things? They said, oh, whatever you think. And I said, well, no, that's not up to me. It was a client that didn't want to interfere with my creative process. And I said, don't worry, you're not interfering with creative process with these kinds of answers. Right. I need to know. I mean, you must have an idea. I worked with Joe Price for a number of years, who was, his family built Frank Lloyd Wright's Price Tower. And later, Goff and I were working on the Japanese pavilion for Joe. It was later built at the L.A. County Art Museum. And it was interesting working with him because I remember several people telling me when I started on that one, they said, boy, you're in a real losing position here. Because, he worked for a number of years with Frank Lloyd Wright, and then he had Bruce Goff design him a house, and now you're going to be constantly being compared with those other two. But Joe was the ideal kind of, he didn't do that. He always told me that his most important decision was choosing an architect. And he spent his time in making that decision. And from then on, he wasn't interfering. And so first it was Wright, later it was Goff, later it was me. And that's an unusual.
So that's really a compliment.
Yeah.
It's a compliment. It's a very unusual client, too.
Yeah, you're lucky.
Looking at things that way. None of the buildings they built looked like each other. And yet it was the same client in a sense. It was actually Joe's idea to hire Wright. He was going to Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, and he happened to go to a lecture by Bruce Goff, who was teaching there at the time. Actually, was the head of the school at the time, and he went to Goff, and he said, "My father wants to build a small office building up in Bartlesville. Would you be interested?" And Goff was busy, very busy at the time, and he said, "No, I'd love to, but I really don't have time. You should get Frank Lloyd Wright." So Goff recommended Wright. It was unusual for one architect to suggest another. And he called Wright, and Wright said, "Well, send them up." And in those days, they had an airplane of their own and flew up to Wisconsin. And that's how that project started. And, of course, Wright, if you know about the program on that building, and this is a little bit against the real organic approach, because Harold Price Sr., Joe and Harold Jr.'s father, owned the Price Company, wanted to build a 3-story office building. And Joe used to tell the story that his dad wanted to build a 3-story building, and Wright wanted to build a 21-story building, and they compromised and built a 19-story building.
So the house you did for George Gradow and Barbie Benton, are they still there?
Yes. The last I talked with them, they were still there.
Okay.
In Aspen. That was an interesting one because Barbie had been with Hugh Hefner for a number of years. I think they never married, but they were together for about 10 years. And then when they split up and she married George Gradow, when that house was under construction, the main structure was up, and I had a call one day, and it was Hugh Hefner, and he was saying that he'd gone by and seen that. And he said, "Boy, I got out of that relationship just in time."
Bart, you're still taking on new projects?
Yes, I've got something under construction in New Mexico now. It depends on who contacts me, but I'm interested in doing more things. It just I want them to really count. So I've never done taken on work just to make money.
Just to do
of course, we got to have money, but I want them to count for something. It's got to be more than just another building.
The website is bartprints.com, and you can also see an extensive listing of Bart's houses at usmodernist.org/prints. Thanks for joining us, Bart.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
George and I were chatting with architect Bart Prints.
Raleigh-based saxophonist, composer, and arranger Peter Lamb has jazz as a sound you'd want to weave and bob, just like he does on the stage. In fact, he's been likened to a giant possessed Muppet. I think it's the hair, Peter, is really what does it.
I think so, too.
In addition to putting out his own CDs, Peter has recorded with artists including the Flesh Tones, Chris Stamey, Ben Folds 5, Josh Groban, and the Mint Julep Band with past podcast guest Laura Windley. He's also recorded with North Carolina's #1 export. No, it's not tobacco, barbecue, or basketball. It's Clay Aiken. Since 2008, Peter Lamb and the Wolves are the go-to jazz band for the important venues and parties around Raleigh-Durham, including, full disclosure, all the NC Modernist Parties events for the last 12 years.
Thank you,
Welcome
George.
back, Peter.
Good to be here. Thank you for doing that. Thank you for hiring us.
So the Wolves are following a long tradition of great bands in the Triangle. Greg Gelb and Group Sax,
Yep.
with Peter Ingram on drums and Kathy Gelb on vocals, played for decades.
Greg was my sax teacher in high school.
He was?
Yes,
Really?
he was.
Oh,
I've
well,
known Greg a long time.
There you go.
Yeah.
So who else is in the Hall of Jazz Fame around Raleigh?
Around Raleigh? Well, there's Chip Crawford, who is a pianist who I think when he was 16 was playing for the Temptations, and now he's on Blue Note and he records with Gregory Porter, who's a really fantastic vocalist.
Yeah.
He's a world famous guy. Well, Ray Codrington, who just passed away this past week, is a trumpet player who was my brother, who's my trumpet player's trumpet teacher, and he was on the original recording of Freedom Jazz Dance with Eddie Harris in the 60s that Miles Davis kind of stole.
Yeah.
And he's a a brilliant musician. We have a ton of musicians in this area.
You really do.
It's saturated. I don't know why, but it's great.
Now, in addition to performing, you are also in demand for teaching at schools around the Triangle.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get kids interested in jazz?
Good question. One way is just to do it. When they see you do it, they're like, whoa, I've never seen an instrument. I mean, I remember the first time I saw somebody really play the drums. It was Max Roach, who was Clifford Brown and Sonny Rollins' drummer. I went when I was in 6th grade. He had done a concert in Durham, and my band director took me, and I was just like destroyed with how much I loved it. And so when you play for kids, I think it just blows their mind that you can do this thing with these inanimate objects, make these sounds, and there's no electricity involved. It's not on a screen. It's a real thing. The other thing is to play music they know. I do stuff like Super Mario Brothers, Legend of Zelda.
I've heard you play that. That is fabulous.
Yeah,
That's smart.
Well, and it's an earbug, right? If you play something that somebody knows, whether it's a kid or an 80-year-old person, and they know it, all of a sudden their attention is changed, and they're paying attention. And once they start paying attention, then you kind of hook them. It's like fishing. So that's what you do.
That's great.
Like fishing.
Now, your new album is Live at Bond Brothers East Side,
Correct.
Volume 1.
Volume 1.
Does that imply there's another volume coming?
Yes. So the deal is it's not another album of our stuff per se. Bond Brothers East Side is a venue that opened post-COVID in Cary, and the guy that runs it, Jay Bond, is a drummer. And he built this place with music in mind, and he has this incredible stage that's wired to be essentially a recording studio that you perform on. And the whole deal with this album is he recorded us when we played there, and we didn't know we were being recorded.
Oh.
And
that's like bugging.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah.
And so we played this gig. This was actually, the album took a few years to come out because of the supply chain issue. This was recorded, it was our 3rd gig after COVID. And during COVID, we didn't play for a year and 8 months. Okay?
Yeah.
We go back, we play at Bond Brothers. We have this amazing energy because we're so happy to be playing music with each other, doing the thing that we love that we hadn't done in forever. And the next day, Jay Bond, he calls me. He's like, man, I recorded last night, and it sounds phenomenal. I'm like, are you kidding? He sends me an MP3, and it's unbelievable. And we had no idea we were being recorded. And so if you listen to the album, there's a little bit of banter at the beginning, and it's because it was just a gig. I got up on stage, and I said, hey, hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Tip your bartenders. Thank you for being here, like I would do at any gig. And we thought that was fun to keep on the album, so it's on there. But yeah, there's one song on the album no one in the band had seen until they stood on stage, because I had just written it. And that's from Centerville with Love. So what you're hearing is the first read-through of a song, not knowing we were going to be recorded. And it ended up, I think it's a great version of it. So there it is.
That's like fresh-made bagels right out of the oven, right?
It's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, it's a real sight reading test, too.
Oh, man. Well, the guys, I'm fine, but my band is really amazing. So I throw them stuff and they just hit it right back at me.
Tell us about this first song from the album, I Love Paris.
Okay, I Love Paris is an old jazz standard, and this arrangement of it was arranged by my drummer, Stephen Kaufman, which is unusual that a drummer would arrange anything because they don't usually write or arrange music. But he's a fantastic arranger, and he wrote it for us right before COVID happened. We played it maybe once or twice, and then COVID happened. We didn't play for 2 years. We come back, we started with it. I think it's got a lot of energy. It's got a lot of interplay between the horns and the vocals and the rhythm section, and I love it. And Mark Wells, who sings, knocks it out of the park.
I love Paris in the fall. I love Paris in the winter when it drizzles. I love Paris in the summer when it sizzles. I love Paris every moment of the year. Paris in the springtime. I love Paris in the fall, and I love Paris in the winter when it drizzles. I love Paris in the summer when it sizzles. I love Paris every moment, every moment of the year. I love Paris, why I love Paris? Because my love is here.
All right.
Right on, right on.
I love that. Now, like Billy Joel, who's had a residency in Madison Square Garden for 10 years.
Yep.
It's going to be ending soon. Peter, you have had a residency at Humble Pie twice a month for how long now?
Well, hold on, George.
Okay.
It stopped when COVID happened.
Oh, man.
It's not there anymore. I was there for 12 years.
Okay.
I was. Our first gig as Peter Lamb and the Wolves was at Humble Pie. They hired us when Barack Obama was first won his first election. They had an inauguration party that they put on, and they asked me to put together a band, and I put together this band. And everybody liked the band, and we called it Peter Lamb and the Wolves, and it stuck. And then they had us back until, 2020?
Yeah.
So...
And Humble Pie is a restaurant in Raleigh.
Yes. In fact, our second album is named Humble Pie after those
Okay.
guys. And we were there, it was almost like a paid rehearsal. We were there every other week for freaking 12 years. So we were really tight because of that. It's a great way to do it. You know, the Beatles did that.
Right, in Hamburg.
In Hamburg, that's right. Yeah, they were in that little cave where they played. I mean, they got there 10,000 hours before they were 20 years old.
Right.
You know, just playing together. There's no substitute for that. So I think the band is really, really tight because of what we did at Humble Pie. But we're still playing a ton of gigs in the Triangle, but not at Humble Pie at the moment.
You can go to the website, peterlambandthewolves.com,
Yes.
and see Peter's schedule.
Yep.
You can sign up for his newsletter, which tells you all about things
Which,
coming up.
by the way, George Smart helped me make. Thank you, George Smart.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, the newsletter thing has been really a game changer. I've had a lot of people come up, hey, I got the newsletter. Thank you. I'm at the gig now. They wouldn't have known about it. Thank you very much. So.
Oh, fabulous.
Do you have 4.1 million houses on your newsletter?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Don't know what to do with them, but
4.1
George
million
gave
songs.
them to me.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I do not. I've got like 250 people, but it's nice.
This next song is Where Did You Sleep Last Night?
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So this is a old song that was originally recorded by Leadbelly, the famous blues musician.
Yeah.
But nobody knows if he wrote it or not. There's speculation that he didn't. And the idea is that it's older. It's like kind of like The House of the Rising Sun. Nobody knows who wrote that song. You know, it's
I
just,
didn't know that. It was an anonymous song.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about 200 years old, and it's from New Orleans, and nobody knows.
It's
You know,
like it's public domain.
public domains. Greensleeves is the same way. Nobody knows.
Right.
So this is similar in that regard, and Mark arranged this, the vocalist, and he's always wanted to do it, and it's a very minimal, sparse song, and Mark just, everything Mark does is fantastic, so he knocks it out.
Mark is fantastic.
He is.
Here we go with Where Did You Sleep Last Night?
My girl, don't you lie to me. Baby, tell me, where did you sleep last night? She said, in the pines, where the sun don't ever shine. I shiver my whole life through. Now my girl, where will you go? She said, I'm going where the cold winds blow. And the pines, where the sun don't ever shine. Oh, I shiver my whole life through. A hard-working man, just about a half a mile from here, and his head was found in a driving wheel, but his body was never found. You let it be. Tell me, where did you sleep last night? She said, in the pines, where the sun don't ever set. I'd shiver my whole life.
Paul Rogers, Peter Kimosh, Mark Wells. My name is Peter Lamb. Thank you so much.
Well, bye, Peter.
Hasta la vista, baby.
So, Peter, at the end of concerts, do people hold up their cigarette lighters anymore, or are they just using iPhone lights?
iPhone, yeah.
It's all
Nobody
iPhone.
smokes, thank God. I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Usually people come up and they ask if we have any albums for sale, and we do.
Well, I am holding in my hands the latest album. It is actually an album. It's on vinyl.
Yep.
You play it in this thing called a record player. Those of you that are too young to
we
know
didn't
this.
press any CDs, George.
Oh, wow.
We
That's
actually-
a step.
That really is, man, has that changed over the
Well,
last
if you look
10
at the
years.
statistics, vinyl has surpassed CD sales.
Absolutely.
And you buy
Right.
a car, it doesn't come with a CD player. And everybody that's young is into vinyl. So
Right, so probably the kids have a record player.
yes, and actually, the sound quality on an album is way higher in resolution than what you get on Spotify or anything like that. So if you play this on Spotify and then you play the vinyl, you hear so much more. So it's really nice.
Well, I got rid of my record player about 15 years ago, but I have promised Peter that I'm going to go home and get on Amazon.com and get one of those USB things you just plug in.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'm off to the races playing this in my office.
Please
so
do.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And if anyone out there listening wants a copy of it, email me at peterlamandthewolves@gmail.com. And I'm happy to send them a copy if they send me some money.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's called
I was
sales.
waiting for that part.
Yeah, the old-fashioned bartering system.
Yeah. There you go. Peter, thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have
George,
you
thank
and
you
your
very
band play for us.
Man, you're the best. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Los Angeles, Toronto, Palm Springs, and Malibu. Okay, Tom, we are all done, sir.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and I will be back soon with another monastic modernist edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.